Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and God's blessing be with you. It's an honour to be able to speak on the subject of the preservation of the Bible and the Qur'an. When Christians and Muslims discuss ideas, they often quote from their holy books, the Bible for the Christians and the Qur'an and Hadith for the Muslim. When we are having these discussions, there are often two assumptions that the Muslim has. The first is that the Qur'an is perfect. Let me quote from some Islamic teachers. The Qur'an was memorised by Muhammad and then dictated to his companions and written down by scribes who cross-checked it during his lifetime. Not one word of its 114 chapters have ever been changed over the centuries. Or again, no other book in the world can match the Qur'an. The astonishing fact about the Book of Allah is that it has remained unchanged even to a dot over the last 1400 years. No variation of text can be found in it. But when it comes to the Bible, there's a different assumption that is there. Again, let me quote from an Islamic teacher. The books that are in the hands of the people of the book, the Christians and Jews today, should not be viewed as authentic because they have been distorted, altered and tampered with. These are the assumptions that many Muslims have when discussing matters with Christians. Now, it matters for three reasons, this. Firstly, it actually stops discussion, because a Christian may quote something from one of the prophets, but the Muslim easily just dismisses it because they have this assumption. It's also important, secondly, because Muslims will say that they believe all the prophets, and yet from the Christian perspective, in practice, what we see Muslims doing is not reading those prophets. And so it doesn't seem that they really believe them. And thirdly, it matters because it's how we determine what the message of the prophets are. And we want to know what the message of the prophets are. And so for one group to be saying your book's corrupted and the other not, it affects how we come to that decision. So tonight, we're discussing a very important issue, and I want to begin with the preservation of the Qur'an. Now, Islam is based on the Qur'an and the Hadith, but tonight I'm just considering the Qur'an and its preservation. The preservation of the Hadith would be an important issue, but we won't do that tonight. Now, regarding the preservation of the Qur'an, we're told that it was a matter of simple dictation, and then it was perfectly memorised and preserved by Muhammad's followers. But there's actually more to it than this. I want to read us from a hadith here from Imam Bukhari, and I'll be quoting from these types of sources tonight. Narrated by Al-Bara, there was revealed, not equal are those believers who sit at home and those who strive and fight in Allah's cause. So from Surah 4, verse 95. The Prophet said, call Zayd for me and let him bring the board and the ink pot and the scapula bone, that is the writing equipment. Then he said, right, not equal are those believers who sit and to those who sit. And at that time, Amir bin Maktam, the blind man, was sitting beside the Prophet. He said, O Allah's apostle, what is your order for me as regard the above verses? I am a blind man. So instead of the above verse, the following verse was revealed. Not equal are those believers who sit at home, except those who are disabled by an injury or blind or lame, and those who strive and fight in Allah's cause. So we see that there was the first version of the verse, Surah 4, verse 95, and then a later, we could even say an improved version to cover other situations. Now this type of changing of what Muhammad recited happened so often that it made the Meccans comment about it and were critical of him, and it actually evoked a response in the Qur'an itself. And so we read here, and when we exchange a verse in place of another, and God knows very well what he is sending down, they say to Muhammad, thou art a mere forger. So you can see how this issue of changing what he was saying actually was noticed by those around him, and a verse needed to be revealed. He needed to say a verse to cover this. This shows that the Qur'an was fluid during Muhammad's lifetime, and its preservation was not simply dictation and memorisation, as certain parts were revised. My next point is that Muhammad never collected the Qur'an into one volume, and this caused preservation problems. Let me just read to you from the Hadith again, narrated by Zayd bin Thabit. I suggest you, O Abu Bakr, order that the Qur'an be collected. I said to Umar, how can you do something which Allah's apostle did not do? See, Muhammad never compiled the Qur'an into a final volume. It was his companions who collected the Qur'an into one book, but they had memorised the Qur'an differently. Again, consider this hadith, narrated by Ibrahim. The companions of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud came to Abu Darda, and before they arrived at his home, he looked for them and found them. Then he asked, "Who among you can recite the Qur'an as Abdullah recites it?" They replied, "All of us." He asked, "Who among you knows it by heart?" They pointed at Al-Qama. And he asked Al-Qama, "How did you hear Abdullah ibn Mas'ud reciting Surat Al-Layl?" Al-Qama replied, or recited, "By the male and the female." That's a certain verse from the Qur'an. Abu Adar said, "I testify that I heard the Prophet reciting it likewise, but these people," this is in Iraq, "want me to recite it by him who created male and female, and by Allah I will not follow them." You see, Muhammad's companions did preserve the Qur'an by memorising it, but the hadith itself testifies to it being memorised differently. These different versions of the Qur'an began to cause trouble among the Islamic community, and so the third Caliph Uthman solved this problem by burning all of these other versions and making one standard version. We read, "Uthman sent to every Muslim province one copy of what he had copied and ordered that all other Quranic materials, whether written in fragmentary manuscript or copies, be burnt." Now, most of the companions did receive and accept Muhammad's standard version of the Qur'an. However, not all of them did. And so again we meet Abdullah ibn Mas'ud again. And it says here in the Sahih Muslim, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud reported that he said to his companions to conceal their copies of the Qur'an. And so they didn't give them up for burning. Now, the differences between these different versions of the Qur'an was a subject of many of the early scholars of Islam in the classical period. A particular librarian named Abi Yaqub al-Nadim was a librarian who made a catalogue of the Arabic books in the year 377 AH or 987 AD. And in doing so, he actually goes around and collects Qur'ans from different locations, and he gives different lists of the different surahs that were in them. And he notices that the surahs are in different order and sometimes have extra surahs or fewer surahs. In fact, he makes an entry in his catalogue on this, and the title of the entry is the books composed about the discrepancies in the Quranic manuscripts. And it goes through all these different main capital cities of the Islamic Empire, and there were 7 books that he lists in his catalogue recording these. When these Islamic scholars are quoted either directly or from later people who use them, we see that they say about these early versions of the Qur'an that the number of surahs varied between 110 and 111. The order of the surahs were different. Sometimes the verses had different number of words or words in different orders. And they also had a different attitude to the Bismillah and whether or not it was part of the Qur'an. Therefore, historically, the preservation of the Qur'an is not as many Islamic leaders tell us. There were different memorised versions of the Qur'an with different canons of surahs, different numbers, and a standard version was made and the others were burnt. I'd now like to look at the current situation with the Qur'an. As I quoted before, Christians are often told that the Qur'ans around the world are absolutely identical. However, this is not the case. There are different versions or readings in the Arabic qira'at of the Qur'an used around the world. These qira'at are famous recordings of how 10 famous men recited the Qur'an. If you actually want to read the Qur'an, you have to read it according to one of these famous reciters. The most popular one is the one standardised by the Islamic Empire, and that is by Imam Hafs. And so this is the one that is used in the majority of the Islamic world. But Warsh, according to the Qur'an, according to Imam Warsh, is the Arabic Qur'an used in most of North Africa, and Imam Khaldun's version is in Algeria, and Al-Juri is in the Sudan. But as I said, there are 10 accepted versions. It's often said by Islamic leaders that these different versions are only different in terms of accent, but this is actually not the case. If we just consider chapter 21, verse 4, the top Arabic there is from Warsh, and I'll see how my Arabic goes. It's Kul, Rabi, Yai, Lamu, something like that, forgive me. And that means, say, my Lord knows. And so in the Warsh transmission, it's God saying say, which is a phrase that is often in the Qur'an. But in the Hafs transmission, it says, Kala Rabbi Ya Lamu, which is, he said, my Lord knows. This may seem like a small change, but it changes the subject of the sentence from God to Muhammad. There are actually 10 of these versions, as I said before, and there are Qur'ans you can get, they're not easy to get, which have the variants of all the 10 listed in the margins. And there are over 4,000 differences between these authorised versions. Another difference between these Qur'ans is the Bismillah. This is the introduction that you read at the beginning of the surahs of the Qur'an, saying, in the name of Allah the Merciful and the Compassionate. Now, it's interesting that amongst these 10 authorised versions, they don't all accept the Bismillah as actually part of the Qur'an. And so we read here in this Islamic scholar saying, the readers themselves differ over whether the Bismillah was a verse in Surah Fatiha and the other surahs. Among the readers, Ibn Kathir, Azim and Al-Kazi were the only ones who considered it to be a verse at the beginning of each surah, whereas the others did not. And so the exact knowledge about the Bismillah and whether or not it's actually part of the Qur'an has not been preserved. Now, the majority of Muslims in practice in the world following the Hafs transmission take this as the first part of the verse of each surah, except Surah 9. But with the Warsh transmission, and actually the majority of the readers, it is just like one of the titles that is put there. It's actually just what is said as a way of introducing it, but not part of the Qur'an itself. Therefore, there are actually differences between the modern Qur'ans in various ways. We've also got the ancient manuscripts that we can look at, the manuscripts from the Samarkand manuscript, the new recent discoveries in Sana'a in Yemen, the Bankipur Codex, and the Topkapi manuscript in Egypt. Some of these claim to be written by Uthman, others not. But amongst all of them, there are variants to what is in the modern Qur'an today. And so it is just not true when Islamic leaders say that what they say about the Qur'an, in that it is perfect and free and from any variation and has just come simply to us. But I'm not going to exaggerate it either. I do not believe that the Qur'an is totally corrupt. I'm not trying to say that. The differences do not change the overall meaning of the Qur'an, and it seems to be a credible record of what Muhammad recited. What I am asking for, though, is that people, that Islamic leaders in particular, stop exaggerating this point. The next point I want to move on to is the Bible. The Bible is a collection of 66 books from around 40 different prophets. It's not just from one time, from the time of Jesus, but it's from the time of Moses right through to Jesus and his disciples over about a 1,500-year period. And in the case of each of these books, each of these individual books have their own history as to how they were preserved. So the books of Moses, the first 5 books of the Bible, begin with Moses himself receiving the law from God, speaking with God face to face, receiving the 10 Commandments on the mountain. But we also see, as we read the later books of Joshua and 1 Samuel, that other prophets were also involved in the preservation and addition to the books of Moses. And so the books of Moses become a work of a number of prophets according to the Bible. The Psalms of David were also used in the temple and preserved within that area. There were prophets like Amos, Isaiah, Jeremiah and Daniel who we read in the Bible. And often we're told about their scribe who was with them, or that they had a school of prophets with them. And these people were responsible for keeping their the words that they said preserved. After the exile for Israel, that was a time when Israel was banished from the land and suffered greatly. And it was when they start to come back that they begin, it seems, to gather all of these books together, these different scrolls that they have. And we have a reference to Nehemiah collecting these books together. When we want to have a list of exactly what these books are, we can't find really any early list. We certainly get references to the fact that they had scriptures, but to get a complete list, we've really got to wait to the period of the early centuries of the Christian era. And just as the early Muslims had to discuss the canon of what was in the Qur'an and which surahs were in and which weren't, it was the same with the Bible as well, with the Old Testament. When we consider the Gospel, now moving to the New Testament, we see that Jesus sent his apostles to the nations, And we actually know